Hello, my name is Ed Sexton, and I'm a counseling student at East Carolina University. I was reading an article in regards to, or by Carl Rogers, and the name of the article is The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Therapeutic Personality Change. Over the years, therapy has changed. It seems like it used to be, what I have perceived, it used to be more of the client depending more on the therapist to help. But now we're seeing a little bit of a role change. We're seeing more of where the therapist is putting more of the responsibility on the client. Now, Carl Rogers on this article mentions that there is change, and he talks about the change being um, in regards to therapy. He states the question to which I would wish to address myself is it possible to state in terms which are clearly definable and measurable in the psychological conditioning? Another area of this talks about how constructive personality change can allow the therapist, excuse me, the client to change. But this is where the therapist needs to know what to say and needs to grasp the respect from the client. Um, this states for constructive personality change to occur, it is necessary for the conditions to exist and continue over a period of time. Number one, two people are in a psychological contact. This is where Carl Rogers is talking about the two people need to be in contact. There needs to be communication. The less communication, the less the therapeutic process would be. So, a key factor here in this type of therapy, especially with Carl Rogers, is communication. Second, the first whom we shall term the client is in a state of incongruence, being invulnerable or anxious. This is where the client is coming to the therapist and talking to the therapist, wanting help or thinking that the therapist can perform a miracle. Well, what I'm perceiving from the article is that yes, the therapist can help the client, but the client has to take the responsibility of wanting help too. The client has to end up taking responsibility on the actions of him or herself. So when it talks about the vulnerability, the client is coming to the therapist very vulnerable. Third one, the second person who we shall term the therapist is congruent or integrated in the relationship. The relationship between the client and therapist needs to be more of a trustworthy. The client needs to trust the therapist, and the therapist needs to trust the client. This is where the client, and it talks about integrating in a relationship. You need to integrate more trust between both parties for the therapy to be successful. Number four, the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for the client. In other words, don't cut or slice the client up. You need to be more positive. Let the client know, okay, there's positive there. Okay. Work with the positive and then actually go into the area where the problem's at. The client needs to understand that positive is the way to work this thing out. Positive creates a positive relationship between the therapist and the client. The next one, number five, the therapist experiences an empathetic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference and endeavors to communicate this experience to the client. Again, when the therapist needs to communicate to the client. It is important. This is where the trust comes in. And the therapist, again, needs to communicate, needs to let the client know, okay, this is an area we need to work in, or this is an area we need to get away from. Again, for the third or fourth time, this deals with trust between the client and the therapist. Number six, the communication to the client of the therapist empathetic understanding, and unconditional positive regard is to a minimum degree achieved. Let's read it again. The communication to the client of the therapist's empathetic understanding and unconditional positive regard is to a minimal degree achieved. So in other words, what they're saying is there needs to be understanding of the problem that the client comes to the therapist about. And no other conditions are necessary if these 6 conditions exist and continue over a period of time. The process of constructive personality change will follow. We're looking at the client comes to the therapist wanting change. The therapist wants to help the client to the point of wanting him or her to change. Because the way to a successful therapeutic procedure or session is understanding the client, understanding the therapist giving the client advice or working with the client in the areas that he or she is weak in. I really thought the article was good. I really enjoyed the therapeutic procedures that Carl Rogers used. I also like what Fritz used too. That was a very good one. So I'm Ed Sexton, and I'm signing